Manhattan, wedged between 5th and 6th Avenue, there is a park where office workers eat lunch on folding chairs and tourists line up for the bathroom. Bryant Park, 9.5 acres of gravel paths and pruned hedges, backed by the New York Public Library. Underneath it, still, right now, today, are the bones of a potter's field, thousands of unmarked graves from the 1820s and 1830s, the anonymous dead of a city that was only just learning how to be enormous. And on top of those bones, in the summer of 1853, someone built a palace made of glass. Not a metaphor, an actual palace. 173,000 square feet of iron and plate glass, shaped like a Greek cross, crowned by a dome 100 feet across that rose 123 feet above the floor. It was, at the time of its completion, the largest building in the Western Hemisphere. It took 6 months to build. It stood for 5 years, and it burned to nothing in less than 25 minutes. The man behind the building, or one of them, was a Dane named Georg Carstensen. Born in Algeria in 1812, raised in the Near East, trained as a military officer in the Royal Guards, Carstensen's real talent was spectacle. In Copenhagen, he had created Tivoli Gardens, the pleasure park that still operates today. He was a publisher, an entrepreneur, a man who understood crowds. By 1852, he was in New York, pitching a vision he had borrowed from London. 2 years earlier, the Great Exhibition of 1851 had stunned the world. London's Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, a greenhouse blown up to the scale of a cathedral, had drawn 6 million visitors in 6 months. Every industrialized city on the planet wanted its own version. New York's business class saw an opportunity. A group of bankers and politicians formed the Association for the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations, sold $459,000 in capital stock, and secured a rent-free lease from the city for the land at Reservoir Square. The only stipulation for the building's design, it had to be constructed entirely of cast iron and glass. Carstensen and his partner, a German architect named Charles Gildemeister, won the commission over some formidable competition. James Bogardus, the self-taught New York engineer who had erected the Edgar Lang stores in 1849, the first structure with self-supporting multi-storied exterior walls of iron, submitted a wild proposal, a 300-foot circular tower with a roof suspended by chains. It would have been unlike anything ever built. Leopold Eidlitz, who would later design the New York State Capitol in Albany, also entered. Even Joseph Paxton, the English gardener turned architect who had designed the London original, put in a bid. The committee chose the 2 immigrants instead, neither of whom had built anything on this scale before. The dome was the thing. It was the centerpiece of their design, the focal point of the Greek cross, the reason people craned their necks when they first walked inside. The Guide to the Fair, published in 1854, called it the largest dome erected in the United States. Light poured through the glass panels and hit the floor in shifting planes. The arms of the cross stretched 365 feet in each direction, and the whole structure was oriented so that 3 entrances on 6th Avenue, 40th Street, and 42nd Street funneled visitors toward that central dome, toward the sky held up by iron. But the building was already in trouble before it opened. The original budget was $200,000. The architect's plan required $300,000. The final cost landed somewhere around $350,000. Cost-cutting stripped the design of a basement level, which would have elevated the whole structure 6 feet and hidden the massive granite walls of the Croton Distributing Reservoir directly behind it. A man-made lake covering 4 acres, surrounded by 50-foot walls, the city's water supply. Without the basement, the palace sat on the same grade as the reservoir, and the reservoir loomed. A planned fountain was scrapped. During construction, a hailstorm killed 3 workers, shattered windows, and flooded the exhibition floor. The architects were barely mentioned at the opening ceremony. President Franklin Pierce came anyway. On July 14, 1853, he stood inside the dome and dedicated the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations, America's first World's Fair. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis was there too, 7 years before secession. Nearly 4,400 exhibitors from 24 nations had shipped their goods to 42nd Street. Singer sewing machines demonstrated by women on the exhibition floor, cannons from Europe, daguerreotype cameras from New York and Philadelphia, carved rosewood furniture, artificial flowers, Majolica pottery, Fresnel lenses, a patented violin designed by the painter William Sidney Mount. The painting galleries were the largest ever assembled in the country. Sculpture filled the naves. A colossal equestrian George Washington occupied one of the central positions, flanked by allegorical works and classical reproductions. The building itself was painted in polychrome, not the white that most people imagine when they hear the word crystal. Reds, blues, and yellows brightened the iron framework. Admission was 50 cents, roughly $17 today. Across the street, an entrepreneur named Waring Latting was building something even stranger. The Latting Observatory was a wooden tower, braced with iron, 315 feet tall. Taller than the spire of Trinity Church, which at 290 feet had been the tallest structure in the city. Latting's tower had 3 observation platforms, at 125 feet, 225 feet, and 300 feet, each fitted with telescopes. From the top, visitors could see Queens, Staten Island, New Jersey. It was, for a moment, the tallest structure in New York. The original plans called for a steam elevator to carry visitors to each level, but that would have been unprecedented. The tallest elevator in existence at the time reached only 75 feet. No elevator was installed. Visitors climbed. More than 1 million people visited the Crystal Palace before the exhibition closed on November 1, 1854. That number sounds like a triumph. It was not. The London exhibition had drawn 6 million. The sponsors of the New York Fair lost $300,000. Attendance had started strong and then cratered. By 1854, the novelty had worn off. The admission price was cut in half, to 25 cents. And still the crowds thinned. Theodore Sedgwick, the first president of the Crystal Palace Association, bore the brunt of the criticism. He was replaced by someone who knew something about filling a room. P.T. Barnum took over the presidency in 1854 and staged a reinauguration that May. He brought in Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous preacher in America, and Elihu Burritt, the so-called learned blacksmith, as featured orators. Interest spiked, briefly. But Barnum also understood that the palace needed more than speeches. He needed a stunt. In May 1854, a mechanic from Yonkers named Elisha Graves Otis approached Barnum with a proposition. Otis had founded the E.G. Otis Elevator Company the previous September. In his first 7 months of business, he had received exactly one order, a freight hoist. He needed attention. Inside the Crystal Palace, where a statue of George Washington had once stood, Barnum positioned Otis's machine, an open wooden platform that could be hoisted between 2 rails by a steam-powered rope cable. Otis climbed aboard. The platform rose. The crowd looked up. Then an assistant took an axe and cut the rope. The platform lurched, dropped a few inches, stopped. Otis's ratchet and pawl safety device caught the rails and held the car in midair. He looked down at the gasping crowd and said the words that Scientific American would later reprint and that elevator histories would repeat for the next 170 years. 3 years later, in March 1857, Otis installed the first safety passenger elevator in the E.V. Hawout department store on Broadway. Within decades, the device that was demonstrated inside a doomed glass building between 40th and 42nd Street would make the skyscraper possible. Every building taller than 5 stories in Manhattan owes a debt to the moment a mechanic cut a rope under a dome that no longer exists. Walt Whitman was a regular. He came during the day and at night, alone and with friends, browsing the displays under gaslight from thousands of gas lamps. The Crystal Palace stayed open in the evenings, and Whitman preferred those hours, the building quieter, the exhibits lit by flickering gas jets that made the glass walls glow from the inside, the dome overhead like a second sky turned amber. He was particularly drawn to the painting collection, the largest ever assembled in the country at that point, and to the daguerreotype exhibits, which included work by local photographers from New York and Brooklyn. Among them was Gabriel Harrison, who in 1854 took the photograph of Whitman that became the frontispiece for the first edition of Leaves of Grass. The image of the poet with his hat tilted, his shirt open, the posture that would define him. An American book that changed American literature, set in motion in part by a portrait taken inside a glass building that was already failing financially. Whitman later called the Crystal Palace an original, perfectly proportioned American edifice. He kept coming back even after most of the city had stopped. By the end of 1854, the exhibition was over. The building remained. The Crystal Palace Association tried to figure out what to do with 173,000 square feet of glass and iron that nobody was paying to enter. The American Institute, a civic organization dedicated to promoting domestic industry, leased the space for its annual fair, a smaller version of the World's Fair that ran each autumn. For a while, that kept the lights on. But the building was leaking, not metaphorically, the glass panels, the iron joints, the flat roof that had been engineered for potential expansion. Rain came in. The exhibits that hadn't been shipped home sat in damp air. In 1856, the Latting Observatory, that wooden tower across the street, was purchased by the Hydeville Marble Works. The new owners inexplicably removed the top 75 feet. A tower that had been 315 feet tall was now 240. Nobody explained why. Then, on August 30th, 1856, sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, a fire broke out in a cooper's shop at 49 West 43rd Street. It jumped. The Latting Observatory caught, and the flames were visible for miles. Spectators rushed toward 42nd Street, terrified the tower would topple onto the Crystal Palace and crush its north side. It didn't. The observatory burned straight down into a mass of smoldering cinders on its own foundation. More than 12 buildings were destroyed. The Hydeville Marble Works lost $100,000 in merchandise and structures, of which only $17,500 was insured. The New York Times called the tower a conspicuous landmark that would be greatly missed, and also, in the same article, a stupendous failure that had never returned a cent on the $150,000 invested to build it. The Crystal Palace survived. Barely. By 1856, the palace itself had been declared a piece of dead property by the Times. The Crystal Palace Association was dissolved. Its assets were handed to a court-appointed receiver. People suggested turning the building into a produce market, a museum, a train station. The receiver tried to renew the 5-year lease with the city. This became a complicated legal and political argument that went nowhere useful. The exhibits were cleared out. Where thousands had once crowded the naves, a single cashier sat at the entrance. For 25 cents, anyone who wanted to could walk the empty building. The dome was still there. Light still came through the glass. But the building had been marketed from the start as fireproof. Iron and glass, the materials of the future, immune to the conflagrations that regularly leveled whole blocks of wooden New York. What the promoters had not mentioned was the floor, pitch pine, laid in thick planks across the interior, and pitch pine burns fast, burns hot, and does not stop. The economy collapsed. The Panic of 1857 brought down hundreds of financial institutions. By mid-October, banks were unsteady, business had stalled, half the brokers on Wall Street were unemployed, and tens of thousands of working men and women in the city had no jobs. Winter approached. The mayor hired some of the unemployed to work on city projects, Central Park among them, and paid them in cornmeal, potatoes, and flour. In April 1858, the Crystal Palace hosted a charity ball. Rich New Yorkers danced under the dome, while outside, the city was still digging out from the worst financial crisis in a generation. In September 1858, the building hosted a celebration of the first transatlantic telegraph cable, a moment of fleeting technological optimism. A month later, the cable failed. It would not be successfully replaced for another 8 years. October 5, 1858, a Tuesday. The American Institute was holding its 30th annual fair inside the Crystal Palace. Nearly 2,000 people were in the building. Shortly after 5 in the evening, a fire broke out in a lumber storage room on the side facing 42nd Street. The New York Times would later describe the fire as incendiary, arson, essentially, because nobody could explain how a building made of iron and glass could burn the way this one did. The answer was the pitch pine. The floors, the framing, the lumber stored inside, it all fed the blaze. The fire spread in every direction. The dome, that dome, the one that had caught the light in 1853, the one Otis had performed under, the one Whitman had wandered beneath at night, collapsed in 15 minutes. The entire structure was gone in 25. The Times reported that the destruction was more rapid than any building of wood could possibly have been. Nearly 2,000 people were evacuated. Not a single person died. The losses were enormous. Estimates ran as high as $500,000. The building itself valued at $125,000, the rest in exhibits, merchandise, machinery, and statuary that had remained from the original World's Fair. A man named Franklin Harvey Bigelow, an exhibitor at the American Institute Fair, wrote a letter to his sister Elizabeth describing the collapse. His cases and their contents went with the rest. His personal loss, he estimated, was about $900, roughly $23,000 today. Afterward, a woman named Mrs. Richardson, who had been burned out in the fire, obtained permission from the mayor and the court-appointed receiver to collect souvenirs from the wreckage. Fused glass, melted iron, twisted remnants of a building that had been billed as fireproof. She sold them at the Palace Garden as interesting souvenirs of all that remains of the finest building ever erected in America. Currier and Ives, the lithography firm on Nassau Street, produced a hand-colored print of the blaze. In the foreground, a company of red-shirted New York City firemen haul a wagon toward the inferno. The dome is a shell of flame. The print sold widely. The fire made better art than the building ever had. Georg Carstensen never saw the fire. He had returned to Copenhagen in 1855, tried to build a rival to Tivoli Gardens called the Alhambra in Fredericksburg, failed, and died on January 4, 1857, at the age of 44. The only trace of his last project is a street in Copenhagen named Alhambravej. Gildemeister went back to Germany in 1857 and died in 1869. Neither man's death was remarked upon in the American press. The ruins of the Crystal Palace were cleared. The site reverted to open land. For years it was simply a gap in the city, a vacant lot at 42nd Street that had briefly held the largest building on the continent. During the Civil War, Reservoir Square served as an encampment for Union Army troops. In 1863, the draft riots tore through the neighborhood. Mobs attacked draft offices, burned buildings, and lynched black New Yorkers in the streets. The area that had hosted the first World's Fair in the Americas, where nations had met in peace beneath a glass dome, became a staging ground for a war that would kill more than 600,000 people. In 1884, the park was renamed for William Cullen Bryant, the editor of the New York Evening Post. The Croton Reservoir, those massive granite walls that had loomed behind the Crystal Palace, was demolished in 1899, on the same ground The New York Public Library was completed in 1911. Its rear facade faces the park where the palace stood. A young Samuel Clemens, not yet Mark Twain, visited the Crystal Palace as a teenager. He later described it as beautiful beyond description. His words are quoted on a historical marker that stands today near the site. The marker is easy to miss. It is surrounded by the lunch crowd, by the seasonal ice rink, by the green chairs and the plane trees and the cafe tables. There is no glass left. There is no iron. There is no dome. The ground holds what it has always held in that part of Manhattan. Whatever the city puts there, and whatever the city takes away. Bryant Park closes at midnight. The chairs are stacked. The cafe umbrellas come down. On the west side of the park near 6th Avenue, roughly where the 40th Street entrance to the Crystal Palace would have been, the ground is level and quiet. Underneath, the Potter's Field. Above, nothing but air where a dome once held the light.